Hi, this is Danny Gizzi with Aircraft Executives, an aircraft brokerage firm out of Atlanta. And today we got Ryan Cranford with Rhodes Risk and Advisors. He's a principal and aviation practice leader that specializes in insurance for aviation. And today we're going to talk about the aviation insurance side of aircraft sales, transactions, and ownership of an aircraft. Without further ado, introduce you to Ryan.
Yeah, absolutely. Ryan Cranford. I'm the aviation practice leader at Rhodes. I am an insurance broker with an emphasis in the general aviation and commercial aviation space. I've been in insurance for coming up on 17 years. I spent about a decade of that in the underwriting world with two of the largest global insurance companies, and then transitioned over to Rhodes a little over 8 years ago to help build out the firm and our aviation practice in the brokerage space.
Thanks. So today we're going to go over a little bit of the process of when you buy or you're trading out your aircraft, when you get insurance involved and stuff like that. The whole process is, and how your relationship with your broker and what all he brings to the table for you, and the kind of state of the market and a couple of other things that we'll talk about in insurance. So why don't we just kick it off at the top of, hey Ryan, when should someone start engaging with their aircraft broker, whether you're a first-time buyer or repeat customer, when you're dealing with selling their aircraft or trading up or down?
Yeah, and we know in the transaction space the timetables are always very dynamic. We've had conversations where we're brought in well ahead of the engagement, and then also situations where it's last minute and insurance hasn't been solved and we need to solve that very quickly. But I think broadly speaking, when you're getting towards the point of an LOI or getting really serious about making an engagement on an aircraft, I think it's great to speak with a aviation broker, or if you have one, or someone in your resource wheel, mainly to see about feasibility. The market shifts. Sometimes it's easier to get insurance done, sometimes it's harder, but I always encourage our partners in the transaction space at least evaluate it early before getting serious on an aircraft from a feasibility standpoint, both from pricing and an operational standpoint. Is what the client wants to do with this airplane doable? Because we don't want to get too far down the road in the transaction and have insurance be an issue.
Okay. Before circling back in that, what is one of the misconceptions of when people hey, I got this? We'll get a client, for example, say, I got a quote from this person, whatever, but do you have someone that you recommend? I didn't like that quote and stuff and we try to explain to them, hey, aviation insurance, there's a different realm to this about you can't shop brokers kind of stuff. Can you hit on that a little bit?
Sure, and we can definitely talk about the role of the broker more in depth, but in the aviation underwriting space, especially in the GA world, there might be 12 to 15 markets domestically, and there's also maybe on a certain type of aircraft 6 to 8 that can play on that particular platform. And so a good broker is going to know their marketplace and go out to the entirety of the marketplace to try to arrange the insurance strategy. Because of that limited distribution, as well as the expertise required in aviation, the underwriting markets are very particular about who they will appoint to do business with them. So I know it's frustrating and can be confusing to clients, but there kind of is this one in, one out broker system where if a broker is engaged with an underwriting market, they are solely going to assign their underwriting product to that broker unless a formal change is made. So if one broker has gone out to the entire marketplace and then someone comes in later, they're going to say, we're blocked with all those markets. We don't have the ability to help you without a formal engagement, which will require replacing the old broker. The reasoning for that, which I feel like it can be confusing and frustrating to the end user, is that with these underwriting companies have a limited amount of personnel and they have to try and make money on their time as well. What they don't want is a scenario where they're quoting the same airplane to 6 different brokers. The data is all over the place. There's no commonality. They give themselves a better chance to engage and really trust a product if they are using one broker who they know has the trust and rapport with the client, really understands the data and can convey it properly. And then they also have personnel all over the country, and they don't want to have a situation where their product is diluted because one broker has gotten a quote from one underwriter in Atlanta, and then another broker in California used an underwriter in Los Angeles, and you have two different quotes from the same company, it doesn't give a good uniform look on their product.
Got it. With that, like, so it's very, so we try to explain that it's very important to make sure you hire the right broker the first time. One, for that reason, and two, you know, you got the two types of brokers out there. And I'm a broker in aircraft sections, and we all get labeled one way or another. But there's one, you know, where it's like, here's the app, and they just shop an app. And then there's the ones that take the time to sell the story to the underwriters and kind of thing. Can you elaborate on what the significantly difference in those things are, and why that's important to, you know, to connect with the right broker?
Yeah, absolutely. And the role of the aviation insurance broker is essentially the intermediary or conduit between the aviation operator or user client and the insurance marketplace. So we serve as the conduit to go and arrange the insurance between those parties. That's the high level answer. Yeah. Beyond that, a good broker is also going to serve as a risk strategist. They're going to manage their program. They're going to try to evaluate what the client really wants out of their program, and then go put that into place. And then even after the transaction or the renewal, they're going to serve that client through the policy term until the next renewal for things that come up. We need to add pilots. We need to add a location. We need to add a new aircraft. We're going to make changes midterm. So a good broker will try to understand the story so that they can get the best end result for how the client wants to operate their aircraft. Sometimes we see a lot of data transaction where, some people it's, hey, I need to quote this aircraft, you're getting a piece of paper, you're filling out data, the data goes off, it comes back, and it seems very transactional. We really try to approach the story behind the numbers. We don't want to just give numbers to an underwriter and trust them to do their best job with it. Based on a good broker's expertise, they'll see what underwriting might take issue with, and we want to be able to explain the story behind that.
Correct.
The reason we do that is we want to create as much appetite and competition in that underwriting marketplace as possible, because obviously more competition, more option leads to a better end result for the client.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of hard to, being in aircraft sales, every owner, buyers, everyone's story and thing is different. It's kind of hard to put all that in paper. But yet sometimes that's all they go off of. So you said something about being a risk assessment advisor and a go-to. Can you explain a little bit more, like, you got them insurance, but like, what are some other services and stuff that come along with being the go-to broker for someone that's like their insurance guy?
Right, and as mentioned, I feel like insurance, there's an event if it's not a new purchase, and it's there's an event every year, the renewal, where you're probably dealing with your broker about 90 days out to gather information. You go through the marketing process, you get a proposal, you put it to bed, you make your decision, and if nothing else comes up, you really don't have a lot of activity until the next year. But as we know, aviation is a much more dynamic environment than that. So the expanded role of the broker is, evaluating the needs that come up during the year, whether it's endorsement requests or certificates or contract reviews, or we're going to purchase another airplane, or we're going to trade airplanes. And then obviously the reason we all purchase insurance is for claims. And so in the event something happens, which we hope never does, but there's a reason insurance exists. So when claims happen, we also serve as the advocate and intermediary with the insurance marketplace to give strategy to that claim, monitor the process, and make sure it's executed on properly for the best result for the client.
Got it. What about, let's talk about like owner pilots for a moment. Obviously those are probably the most storytelling to get bids and stuff for. What are some things from an owner pilot standpoint in the process to help themselves get the best quotes possible? I guess we could talk about like people upgrading from a piston to turboprop, or turboprops to jet, or those kind of things. What are some things that you see day in and day out that had you known them 6 to 8 months before this came to your desk, would have helped them better in their quoting process.
Absolutely. One thing when we're moving into turbine platforms, annual training is pretty much the mandate out there in the marketplace. Not to say there's not creative structures where there's alternative 24-month deals or things like that, but far and wide, it's a pretty much market expectation that owner pilots or professional pilots in turbine equipment are going to train annually. So if you're looking at upgrading to a platform, coming in with the expectation that if I've never flown this aircraft, I'm going to need initial school in this aircraft, and coming to the process with, here's my plan, I'm already looking at slots for this sim time, or I'm going to this in-aircraft group, helps the cause. And then the most difficult owner-pilot situations for us are large transitions in platforms. Like you said, hey, I've flown a Cirrus and I'm looking at upgrading to a turbine, or I've been in a turboprop environment and I'm looking at upgrading into a jet platform. Building as much story and experience of something helping the transition that I can go to an underwriter and say, look, I know this is a sizable leap, but here's how they're approaching the transition. Having a kind of proactive approach that we can go say, hey, they've already thought about this, and from a safety conscious mindset, here's what they're thinking for a transition plan, that the underwriter will say, hey, that makes sense. I can get on board with this. They're already thinking about that, versus situations where I'm upgrading this aircraft, here's my numbers, see what you can do with it. That makes it tougher. And I'm gonna dig in a little bit there and say, hey, kind of what's your plan? Because I've got to go relay the story to create the best package possible on the other side.
I guess I got a couple of questions. Like, what is like what do we see normally? We see like the piston roll going into some kind of small turboprop, or a Vision jet or something like that. What kind of expectations can you expect from an insurance writer in that thing? And then also, let's say a PC-12 guy going into like, some kind of light jet, and then you've got that like cap limit there for single pilot stuff. Can you hit on that a little bit too?
Yeah, when evaluating transitions in the aircraft, I always say, whatever the aircraft we're getting into is, let's create as much meaningful data getting into that aircraft. So if you're upgrading to a jet, but you've flown a PC-12 for an extended period of time, that's beneficial because now we have turbine environment, flying at altitudes, knowing all of those things, and we want to supplement that. Even though you have no jet time, we have a lot of turbine, extensive experience. If you're getting into a jet, we want to highlight any multi-experience that's possible. Going from a King Air into a Citation or something like that, there's a lot of meaningful flight that may not be in the jet yet, but is meaningful to that transition. The Cirrus does a great job moving people from the 22s on through the VJs, and they've really kind of cornered that market on getting agreement for that plan. The great thing there is it's very similar avionics and operational platform into another one, which helps. The harder ones are when we're taking someone from maybe a single piston environment into a multi-engine jet environment, because that's a lot of ground to cover. We're now baking in turbine experience, multi-experience, all of those things that they're going to have to learn in the transition.
Anything else you think you should highlight on the owner pilot world? Had some corporate world stuff.
You brought up single pilot.
Yeah.
I think if it is a large leap, having the expectation that you may have a mentor with you or have some dual expectation on the other side, some people come to the table with that. If they're getting into a new aircraft, they want to feel really comfortable. And so they may come up with that plan anyway. But single pilot, creates more issues than dual crew environments. Owner pilots are generally going to operate in a single pilot environment. So just being conscious that if you are making those leaps, you may not have as much liability available in the beginning. That will build over time, and you may have more mentor time or a little accompaniment after school.
Ryan, speaking of single pilots, over the last probably decade, there's been like kind of a cap of where, insurability for a single pilot on a whole value versus, it's just going to be unrealistic for a single pilot versus just paying someone to sit in the right seat would be cheaper. Can you elaborate on where that currently sits, and like is brand new Phenom 300E,
Mm-hmm.
and CJ4 added a question for a single pilot based on small jump, or with enough experience, is it possible? What's the story now?
Yeah, and I think to your point, it's interesting. In a single pilot jet, we could have $1 million valuation, we could have a $14 million valuation. And obviously, the lower the hull value, especially if we're making a transition, underwriters are more comfortable with that.
Sure.
The same mistake in a $3 million aircraft is less expensive than the same mistake in an $8, $9 million aircraft. But really, if you have a really strong pilot with good experience, we have single pilot aircraft that are, $13 million in value.
Yeah.
You may enter a scenario where you'll hear about quota share, where certain markets won't write above, maybe it's $5 million on a 100% basis for a single pilot aircraft, or some it's 10. And now that we're above that $10 million mark, if we have a strong pilot, we can put a program together. You just may share 50% with one insurance company and 50% with another. I would tell you that if we were making one of those large transitions from a piston, or they didn't have a lot of multi-time or turbine time prior, it becomes more difficult the higher the hull value you get to. I would tell you that there's kind of an appetite for $5 million and below, and then there's a more limited appetite for $10 million and below, and then even less appetite for kind of that 10 to 14 range we're seeing. There can always be a solution, but the higher we get in hull value, we need a better risk profile. So it's tougher to transition into the extremely high hull values.
Yeah, from a broker standpoint, it just seems like that $5 million number we've been hearing for almost 10 years now. It's like $5 million 10 years ago is not that number, and in the push in private aviation with the COVID boom and everything, the whole values are just much higher.
The underwriters have had to rethink it too, because for years and years, 5 million was the number, and then that same aircraft model is now 8, 9, 10, and it's the same profile. It's just a more expensive airplane. So some of the markets too, in the last 24 months, have increased their hull value appetite that they'll ride on a 100% basis, which is part of the soft market, which is a good thing for clients.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking like the CJ3, CJ4s, Phenom 300, 300Es, like that whole market, nothing's changed.
I mean, a brand new PC-24.
Yeah.
They keep raising that value of what we can accommodate on a single pilot basis.
Yeah. Thanks. Which I kind of covered, whether it's whether it's owner flown or corporate, it's kind of the same endeavor environment, I guess you can say. Also talking about the liability limits. I mean, I feel like 10, 15 years ago, $100 million liabilities were just like small fractions to add onto a policy. You always did it. Now I think the cap is more like 50, more or less. Certain policies you're only seeing like people taking out 5 to 25. Like, what is that spread? What is the delta? What do you recommend, and what are you seeing with the those different things?
Yeah, as the insurance advisor, the cliche is always going to be buy as much liability as you can afford or is available to you. I also realize there's a fiscal component to that, so we really do try to evaluate, okay, what is the aircraft? Who are you carrying on it? What are you doing with it? And then also from a larger strategic business perspective, what are the balance sheet implications should something go wrong? So in certain aircraft, we're always going to recommend a minimum liability level due to the amount of passengers. And then from there, when really good risk profiles, we'll go get options for as much liability as we can get. In the single pilot world, you're generally going to see caps around 25. There are some markets that will offer a $50 million limit for a single pilot, but that needs to be the absolute cream of the crop. And generally that's a professionally flown operation. When you get into the dual crew world, in the Part 91 professionally flown corporate environments, we have policies with $500 million liability limits. Granted, not everybody purchasing an aircraft is going to want to get there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really a evaluation of how many passengers, what are the passengers, are there requirements when you move into the larger platforms? If you're going overseas, we want to comply with EU requirements and things like that and not create issues. So.
Sure. Okay. What kind of insurance, I guess, advice would you give to people, considering, 135 operations for managing their aircraft and charter revenues? How does that differentiate from a typical straight 91, quote shop?
Yeah, insurance is, all things being equal, generally going to be more expensive on the charter side. Underwriters view Part 91 as a certain risk profile, and then the airplane that is trying to generate revenue is going to have a little different look, so generally prices are a little inflated on that side. There's also much more of a third-party liability aspect when you're running charter versus pure corporate use internally. Mm-hmm. And we come up a lot in the transaction world where we see an aircraft being purchased and going on a managed program or going to charter leaseback or things like that. That's a separate conversation around what are the benefits of the expenditure offset from that group versus what you may get in a fleet discount by being on that program versus operational control of your aircraft and loss sensitivity to the rest of that fleet should something happen.
Okay, good to know. So kind of gone over, what does an aircraft broker do? The processes of, shopping the rates and how you have to have one person that's the best, client-focused storytelling versus, pushing the paper for kind of a quote. Things to look out for, things to get involved with, how you help them, with things on road claims, whether it's, certificates for flyovers or whatever all that stuff is. Single pilot stuff, liability limits. How about the state of the market? What does that look like for the past couple of years, and what kind of direction are we in right now, and what do you kind of see forecasting come your way?
Yeah, absolutely. And disclaimer, this is August of 2025, and the insurance market is dynamic and goes through hard and soft cycles. It takes a little while to move, but at current, we would be in what's called a favorable to the client or soft market. That's coming on the heels of, up till about 24 months ago, 5 years of a more difficult, not only from a pricing standpoint, but from an operational flexibility standpoint.
Sure.
A hard market cycle where clients were seeing, increases and things like that for having the same exposure. And now we're in a softer market cycle where within the past 24 months, people should see a stable rate environment, if not an advantageous rate environment, where we'll have flat renewals or be getting reductions. At the same time, that operational flexibility is really important in that as well. I mean, saving 15% versus last year is great, but at the same time, having the ability to get a little more coverage or create a little more flexibility in how you operate is a benefit of the soft market as well.
Sure.
I'll also say that everyone's hearing about the softer market. It does make transitions into new aircraft a little easier because there's more appetite for it. At the same time, if someone purchased an aircraft in the last 18 months, they probably already saw the benefit of the updated marketplace.
Sure.
That they may not see a 15% or 7% reduction on their renewal. Where the people that are seeing the biggest reductions are the ones that went through that hard market cycle, and now they're being remarketed with more players at the table and creating more competition and kind of driving that rating down a little bit.
So, I mean, kind of a history lesson, we'll back, can you briefly go back on when the market was soft or when there was a lot of players in the marketplace to what happened and where we are today and how many kind of players you really see in the marketplace from a, underwriting standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something I have a different way of explaining than someone might read in a periodical online.
Sure. Don't go too deep.
Yeah,
high level.
We won't get into the way too analytical or the actuarial side of how underwriting works. But at the end of the day, insurance companies exist to make a profit.
Yeah.
So the pricing they're extending, they have to be able to make money on. The more players in the space, obviously more competition, pricing goes down a little bit. When we have loss-sensitive seasons, that shrinks the competition. People take an exit from the market, and we have less players. Right now we have about, I would call it 12 to 15 on any given risk that might be able to entertain it domestically. You also have London, which is a totally separate animal. But I think what's helpful for people to understand the hard market, you know, you hear GA is incredibly safe. We hear all these statistics about accident rates going down and the safety of flight. What really happened in that hard market cycle is aviation wasn't performing worse from an accident standpoint. We had these extraneous factors where liability awards were going up, so the same loss was having a bigger payout while the insurer was collecting the same amount of premium.
Sure.
And we heard a lot about the 737 MAX and how that all poured down in reinsurance, and you know, that'll make someone's head kind of spin, where that is an effect, but I put it more in the fact that, you know, airplane parts are more expensive, time to repair is more expensive, which is all driving up claims cost. So in that hard market cycle, I would explain to people that said, hey, there haven't been a lot of accidents, I would say, the ones that don't make the news are sometimes the ones driving the cost increases. You know, a client that has a $20 million asset that scrapes a wingtip is never going to make the news, but that might be a $2 to $3 million repair on a policy that's paying $50,000 a year. The underwriting company is never going to make their money back on that account, and that's just one instance of a bunch of things that can happen, like FOD or things like that, that really drove up claims pricing without being in the middle of a bunch of accidents. So premiums raised back up to an appropriate level that more capacity wanted to jump in. Now we have more players in a soft market.
So, I mean, at the very peak high, how many people in the marketplace at one point?
There have been times where you've probably had 20 domestic players, different profiles on what they'll play on, but those are kind of the...
And then the lowest you've seen?
I mean, we were, a couple years ago, you know, there were like sub 10 that would play on a certain type of risk, and then they had really tightened underwriting guidelines where, you know, we may only have one or two options on certain account profiles.
So when healthy, so between 10, 20, 15, that seems pretty healthy.
Yep. Yeah. And then I think it's worth noting, we've seen over the past 24 months, you know, 3 to 4 new entrants, which is always a sign that there's appetite and capacity to get in the market and create more competition.
Perfect. Ryan, one of the questions I'm sure you get a lot is, and I know I hear it, it's like, oh, FAA only mandates this, but then we're going to be like, well, insurance only allows you to do this. Can you elaborate a little bit of your experience of, like, you know, FAA versus insurance rules and why it's important to know that as an operator?
Yeah, I think insurance and the FAA through hard and soft market cycles kind of alternate who can do what in airplanes. Sometimes insurance is the bad guy, sometimes the FAA is the bad guy, but at the end of the day, just because the FAA will allow you to do it does not necessarily mean the insurance policy will afford you the right to do it.
Sure.
You know, I always say, make sure the aircraft purpose of use is being abided by, and the pilots that are allowed to operate it are the only ones operating it.
Sure.
Those are warranted provisions of the policy. And the FAA insurance debate, I always just tell people, even on a very small scale, the FAA will allow you to go get your student pilot certificate in a brand new Cirrus that's $1.5 million. Not every insurance company wants to underwrite a $1.5 million Cirrus. And so as you move up through those platforms, while the FAA may allow you to purchase a single pilot jet that you can fly that's $9 million, not every insurance company is going to want to extend that risk.
Well, I guess we can close it out. Let's talk about, like, you know, take the time to tell people when to call you. What's next?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, if you're evaluating an aircraft purchase for the first time, it's great to get ingrained with a broker who's going to be able to understand your story, understand what you want operationally and how it affects your broader company. Get ingrained early in that process so you have someone trusted to guide you through it, and someone that has, you know, strong relational underwriting capacity, because at the end of the day, that's the group that they're going to have to negotiate with. You know, we always are happy to evaluate programs and take a look, and sometimes we say you're in the best place possible, and other times we're able to maybe give some thought share, a little value of how we would draw it up, and try and view it holistically versus just transactional, like I said. Sure.
Well, thank you guys for joining us. Insurance is always a critical part of the whole process. Most everyone gets insurance, so it's always a good thing to have this kind of intellect to make your best decisions going forward. So thanks for being with us, Ryan.
Absolutely. Thanks.